bachelor and master studies at Politecnico di Torino. And today she will talk about the topic of her PhD about remote sensing for defining biomass features in ecomorphodynamics models. So thanks, Melissa, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see the screen? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And today I will talk about the research I carried out during my PhD, my research concerning ecomorphodynamics. But let's start from the very beginning. My research focused on ecotones. Ecotones are transitional habitats whose shape is conditioned and the evolution of these shapes is due to the continuous interaction between physical components such as fluids and sediments, and also biological components such as organisms, microorganisms, animals, and vegetation. The continuous interaction is very complex. As you can see here, two examples of ecotones, coastal dunes, and riparian corridors. Ecomorphodynamics is the science that tries to study this complex feedback. As you might understand, ecomorphodynamic is a multidisciplinary science. So to advance it, it requires shared methods from these different disciplines, such as biology, hydrology, geomorphology, and so on. The literature points out that to advance ecomorphodynamics need to encompass at least one or better more of the following aspects that are modeling, monitoring, and manipulating. That means carrying out experiments. In my research, I narrowed to two of these aspects that are modeling and monitoring, and I tried to understand if they can effectively communicate each other. Focusing on the first, modeling is a very common way to study ecomorphodynamic systems, and so far different kind of models have been produced, either from analytical to numericals or conceptual. And generally, these models only focus on vegetation as biological part and sediments and water as a physical part. These models generally provides qualitative results because to be more quantitative, they require a lot of input data in order to, for instance, calibrate the parameters for the vegetation dynamics or to generate initial scenarios. So I imagine that the second aspect mentioned before, that is monitoring, could assist modeling in this way. That means to provide input data. However, this brings additional questions, such as which kind of monitoring is required, or also how we can convert monitoring data into useful input for models. Traditionally, the most common way to perform monitoring is to carry out field surveys. Field surveys are very common, but they have some negative aspects. For instance, they are costly, labor demanding, and most of all, they provide punctual data, while ecomorphodynamic studies spatially continuous processes. In the last decades, a new way of performing monitoring has spread, for instance, remote sensing. Remote sensing allows us to survey larger area in a more cost-effective way, and also in a potentially in a multi-temporal way. However, it also has some drawbacks. In particular, remote sensing requires ground truth data and also advanced algorithms to process all these data. So my research assumed that modeling and monitoring can be complementary activities, while never forget the support of field activities. In particular, during my research, I focused on riparian corridors, but towards the end, I tried to also have a look to another ecotones, that is coastal dunes. So let's start from the riparian corridors. In this kind of ecotones, vegetation is actively conditioned by the hydrological regime and also by the morphological evolution of the landscape. In this case, the models, as I mentioned before, requires biomass or also geometry scenario at a certain time in order to be calibrated. And also they require multi-temporal information in order to set those parameters regulating, for instance, the vegetation growth or the vegetation decay after flooding. So looking at the monitoring techniques, in particular at remote sensing, I decided to work with LiDAR data. And this is because LiDAR provides a three-dimensional point cloud representing the Earth's surface and also all the objects standing on it. And that means that it provides the information about the vertical structure of vegetation. And I thought it could be a very useful information for models. LiDAR sensors can be mounted over different kinds of carriers, from aircrafts to space satellites. But in the end, I decided to work with the airborne laser scanner because this kind of instrumentation provides a good compromise between area coverage and spatial resolution. As I said, LiDAR provides a point cloud. And so we might wonder how we can convert the point clouds into vegetation information for models. In the literature, two approaches are very common. The first one is the area-based. That means to provide information about the vegetation that are averaged over a certain area. We found these methods very simple and useful when you have low resolution data. For instance, we applied it to the Cinca River in Spain, where we have data sets with 0.5 points per square meters. In this case, we used the area-based approach to define a biomass scenario. In particular, we subdivided the area according to classes of probability of an inundation based on a previous hydrodynamic model. And then we found the average vegetation height for each class by using a freely available software to analyze LiDAR data. And then we compute the volume and the biomass of the vegetation starting from the height given by the LiDAR data. As you can see in this figure, we were able to reproduce the vegetation scenario. Then we use this vegetation biomass scenario to calibrate a simple analytical model for vegetation dynamics. I will not dive into the details, but this is the model, and you can see the reference, the original work if you are interested in it. And I only want to say that the model is stochastic. That means that it does not provide a deterministic solution for the biomass, but it provides the probability density function of vegetation biomass for a certain location. And this solution requires two input parameters related to the biological features of vegetation that are the decay factor and the carrying capacity. And we use the biomass provided by the processing of the LiDAR data in order to calibrate this model with a least square minimization. So in the end, we had the real and the model biomass scenario. We had the calibrated model, and we applied this calibrated model to inspect the behavior of vegetation for changing hydrological regime. For instance, we wanted to see what could be the response of vegetation for a reduction of the probability of inundation in agreement with the climate projection scenario for the study site. In this case, you see that for a very strong reduction of the probability of an inundation, the biomass reduces almost across over the domain, except for those areas that are very close to the main channel. I mentioned that there were two approaches to work with the point clouds. And the area-based, as I mentioned, is very simple, but because of its simplicity, it does not provide some information, for instance, the tree spacing or the information about the individual features of every tree, for instance, tree height and the crown diameters, as you also can see in this figure. So we moved to another approach, which is the tree-centric, also called the individual tree detection method. And we try to use the methods provided by the literature, and we also set up a new algorithm whose objective is to analyze the point clouds, detect the individual trees, and provides the position and the height of each tree. We also couple this information with orthophotos in order to provide not only the information of each tree, but also the information related to younger vegetation, for instance, shrubs. And all these algorithms are also available online if you are interested in them. And this approach is very useful because it can provide information for more sophisticated models, for instance, the numerical ones. But obviously, it requires to be set up with some parameters based on field measurements. For instance, it requires the relationships between the tree diameters and the tree height, and also it requires the conversion factor between shrubs volume given by the LiDAR data and the shrubs biomass. Once set up these parameters, we can apply, for instance, to set up a biomass scenario, similarly as we did for the with the area-based approach. In this case, I will show the application across the Orco River in Italy, for which we have a higher resolution dataset. We have a LiDAR with 10 points per square meters. As you can see here, we have two LiDAR datasets, one for 2019 and one for 2021. So we were able to apply this approach to define a biomass scenario for the 2 years, and also a scenario of difference of biomass between the 2 years. Also, the individual tree-based approach can support numerical models that have routines for vegetation dynamics. For instance, the Delft3D hydrodynamic models, which has a MATLAB or Python routine to simulate vegetation colonization, growth, and decays. And the support is given by the fact that it can provide the initial map of vegetation, so the configuration for the simulation of time 0, and also it can be used to calibrate the growth and the decay parameters. For instance, in these slides, I compare the application of the Delft3D software and the routine for vegetation dynamics provided by Van Hoorschot, who's used this model to evaluate the evolution of vegetation starting from an arbitrary configuration and using literature values for the vegetation parameters. And then I compare this with our approach, which is to provide both scenarios and vegetation parameters based on LiDAR data. Also, this approach allows us to provide the information that are necessary to define the flow resistance due to vegetation, that is a necessary input for hydrodynamic simulations. For instance, we can couple the information given for each individual tree with the Baptist equation in order to define the additional roughness due to this kind of vegetation. Or also, we can couple the information of shrubs or also information about the leaf area index of this vegetation to specific equations that are able to relate lie with roughness. And here in these slides, you can see an examples of the configuration files of these hydrodynamic models. And in the few minutes that are remaining, I will also mention what we did in the case of coastal dunes. In this case, the models have different needs with respect to the fluvial ecomorphodynamic models, because coastal dynamics are relatively different. In this kind of environments, vegetation dynamics is mainly related to sand transport, and the dunes evolution depends on the vegetation coverage. So the main parameters, the principal parameters of the ecomorphodynamic coastal models is vegetation cover at a certain time, and not vegetation biomass. For this reason, we decided not to work with the LiDAR data, but we decided to work, oh, sorry, I forgot to say that these models also require the beach width as input parameters, which is the distance between the swash zone and the place where vegetation starts to establish. And as I was saying, we decided to work with multispectral imagery because we thought that they were more effective in providing vegetation coverage, especially if we are working with a combination of RGB bands with infrared information. Moreover, multispectral imagery are given by satellite images, so they have a very large, potentially global coverage, and can and it's very easy to have a multi-temporal information, even with a very high frequency of revisit. Moreover, we decided to work with this kind of remote sensing data because online there are many cloud computing platforms available, so we don't need to download, store, and work with terabytes of data, but we can simply work as a client to these platforms. And I will be very brief. I just want to mention that also in this case, we set up a model which is able to provide the inputs for the models that I mentioned before. In particular, we set up a model which is an algorithm which is able to provide the position of the shoreline, also the position based on satellite images, and also the position of the interface between vegetation and the sand. And it is also able to provide the beach width along the transects, and finally to provide information also in a multi-temporal way about the vegetation coverage. So the idea is to use in the future this kind of information to calibrate the available ecomorphodynamic coastal models. So that's all. Just wanted to be an overview about the potentiality of coupling remote sensing monitoring, field surveys, and modeling in order to advance ecomorphodynamic models. Thank you for your attention. And before concluding, I just want to advertise our next coffee break, which will be at the beginning of May, precisely on 2 of May. And in this coffee break, Lorenzo Innocenti from the University of Florence will talk about processes and problems related to wood obstruction at bridges. So thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. If we have some questions, you can do it now.
Yes, if I'm, please.
No, please.
No, go, no worries.
Oh, thanks. No, I would just like to congratulate Melissa for this very interesting work, because I think you correctly mentioned at the beginning that this is a very multidisciplinary research field. So I was just wondering, you know, in this case, when coming with ecohydraulics, there is often a situation where you are very detailed about flooding, but you are little too simple in the vegetation part, or vice versa. But in this case, I see that both parts are treated in a very sophisticated way. So I was just wondering if you, at a certain point of your research, felt somehow the need of interacting with the people doing research about the part related to vegetation, especially because I think you are an environmental engineer, so I think you are comfortable with the flooding part.
Yeah, I work with, actually, I never worked directly with, for instance, biologists, but I work with other researchers involved in the hydrodynamic models who have developed the models with biology, so in a very indirect way. And for instance, the YPN ecomorphodynamic models that I mentioned, the one coupled with the Delft 3D software, was developed at Deltares in Netherlands, and there in that research center, ecologists and fluvial modelers work very closely each other. And you touch a very sensitive point, because I think it will be the step forward of these models to have a very strong collaboration and a feedback from biologists to understand if the calibrated models are really are consistent with what they see in the fields and what they have studied in their only biological models.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, and I would like to ask if you think that your methodology could also be used for civil protection, for example, to prevent polluting events in some way in the future.
For civil protection, yes, regarding flood risk, because vegetation is able to dampen waves during flooding. So maybe if you can model it in a very accurate way, maybe you can also understand how much flooding can be reduced by, for instance, increasing vegetation along the riverbanks. Regarding pollution, I'm not very expert in the field, so I don't know. Actually, I don't know. Maybe you can simulate the effect of pollution on vegetation, in the sense that the environmental conditions and so the, for instance, the growth parameters changes for polluted waters, but I don't know if you can stimulate the vice versa.
Thank you.
If there is time, I'd like also to congratulate Melissa for the topic and for the presentation, and I want to ask something. Well, actually, you mentioned that there is a kind of feedback between vegetation and floods, and this is of course correct. But there are also other kind of feedback from the let's say from the environment, and in particular CO2 concentration and temperature are very important for vegetation dynamics, and also for the interaction with let's say for vegetation and climate change impact. So my question is, have you considered these two external forcing in your study?
In my study, no, because at the beginning I work in a progressive way. So the first model I worked with was the stochastic one, so it's an analytical model. In that case, the only disturbance was the hydrological fluctuations. Then I started to work with a numerical ecomorphodynamic model. And in that case, the disturbance were given by hydrological and morphodynamic changes. Then I know that in the literature there are models that also consider climate projection and external parameters, for instance, the temperature. But I never worked directly on them. But I think the process, the workflow might be the same, in the sense that you have to detect the parameters that need to be calibrated, understand if there are monitoring data sets that can support the calibration of that parameters, and then try to understand if there are already, or if you can develop algorithms in order to directly inform the models starting from the available data set. For instance, of course, every time you need another parameters, you have to consider additional uncertainty, and and you have to perform more sensitive analysis, so the complexity increases.
It makes sense to me. well, actually, when you consider climate change and you consider future scenarios, you can imagine a future with more or less water. So from your point of view, you can, let's say, you can imagine future vegetation dynamics. But if you neglect the effect of temperature increase or the effect of CO2 increase, maybe vegetation dynamics could be, let's say, influenced very much from this kind of dynamics. But I mean, the starting point is already great. So
yeah, thank you. But you're right. You're right. Of course, also CO2 might have a very strong influence on that. So
yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank you.
all.
That's good advice for future studies. Okay. So I think that's all. And we already talked about next coffee break. So I think I can thank you again for your participation and see you in 2 weeks.
See you in Vienna.
Yeah, also.
Yeah.
No, for you, no. For me, no.
Anyway, for those of you who will be in Vienna, I will be there, and I will be happy to meet you in person.
Yes,
Bye.
I will be there too.
Okay,
Bye bye.
bye.
See you in a few weeks.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye. Bye bye.
Bye.